From its inception as a beacon of future technology to its hectic journey through the changing tides of consumer demand, Segway's story is as captivating as it is unconventional. Prepare to embark on a journey through the corridors of innovation and disruption as we unravel the enigmatic tale of Segway. Hey everyone, my name is Matt and I run the Philosophy of Marketing channel. In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into Segway. We're going to realize why this company had initial success in the first place, and we're also going to look at why the company had a downfall and why it lost so much of its hype. We're going to learn a whole bunch of lessons along the way as to what to do as a company and what not to do as a company as well. So without further ado, let's get into it and go over a brief short history of Segway. Born from the visionary mind of Dean Kamen in the late 1990s, Segway emerged as a beacon of innovation in a rapidly transforming world. One of the things that's important to note here is Kamen himself, the inventor of the Segway, holds over 1,000 patents. He's a very smart guy, and all these patents range anywhere from the Segway we're currently talking about to the advanced insulin pump, which is completely different, and it's just amazing to see that one person is capable of inventing so much stuff. But as we will come to find out, just because you can invent and create something doesn't necessarily mean it will sell. Kamen wanted to create something that was mobile and allowed people the freedom to move through cities and really make travel seamless. He took inspiration from science fiction as well as looking at the urban landscape with all of its motor vehicles, bikes, scooters, and cars all throughout the cities. And he saw that there was a lot of stuff that was not very cohesive and didn't allow for that seamless transition of movement that he so desired. Now, it would take quite a bit of work to bring his audacious vision to life, but once he unveiled the product, the Segway PT, or personal transporter, received an amazing amount of hype and recognition worldwide. Segway's PT captured the imagination of so many people, and this really propelled the company to the forefront of the transportation industry. Now, one of the things I found very interesting about Segway's rise was the amount of people who backed it. Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon, originally invested in Segway very early on in the company's life, and Steve Jobs at the time said that cities would actually redesign themselves for the Segway. That's how important this device is. Now, that didn't come to fruition, but you could imagine all these massive players at the time, very wealthy businessmen who were very smart, saying all this great stuff about Segway, propelled it even further into the stratosphere. Now, the first time I personally saw a Segway was on Mythbusters, and it was Adam Savage riding around on one. It looked so cool, and he was so seamlessly able to ride it. Turns out they're not super easy to ride, and that would be one of Segway's big problems later on in its life cycle, as we will soon discuss. But this was just something that encompassed the entire planet. Everyone was talking about Segways at this time, as it was just so different and all on its own. Kind of like how Tesla was early on with Elon Musk, how this car was just all on its own. There were no other electric cars. That's the only one, and it was just so revolutionary that everyone was talking about it. Now, despite amazing hype and a whole bunch of backers for this company, Segway did have a massive amount of challenges that it needed to overcome in order to be successful. And one of the most glaring problems right off the bat was Segway's high price point. They originally launched the Segway personal transporter at $5,000 in 2001. Now, in 2001, you could buy a car for that price, so it was very difficult trying to convince the average person to invest in one as opposed to investing in a car, as you could easily understand. That being said, they were also going after the average consumer, which seems like a weird choice, as they were just going to target everyone, and as we know in marketing, if you target everyone, you target no one, and trying to sell a $5,000 transportation device to an average person is going to be pretty difficult. So really early on in the actual life cycle of the Segway personal transporter, they switched into the tourism and police industries and found more success there. However, they had already used quite a bit of their budget going after the average consumer. Now, another thing that the Segway struggled with was the actual communication right off the bat. What were they selling in the first place? Yes, they are selling this advanced technology that looks super cool and you can move around on it, but what is the benefit for the average person? And when you actually listen to their first PR release, which was on Good Morning America, I'll play a clip for you.
You stand there, it goes forward and backward.
It's sort of like putting on a pair of magic sneakers. You stand on this Segway HT and you think forward, you go forward. You think backward, you go backward.
they really couldn't communicate it all that well. They said it's like putting on a pair of magical sneakers. Now, this sounds great, but what does it actually do for me? People want their problems solved, and they want maybe more ease of use when it comes to mobility. Maybe it seamlessly goes in and out of buildings and it's super easy and it's more effective than a car and it saves on time. That makes sense. But if you're just saying magical sneakers, it's going to be a little difficult to sell. Another big problem with the Segway early on was the amount of regulations around Segways. This was shocking to me, as the amount of regulations state to state in the United States vary from being able to use a Segway anywhere you want, on public roads and on sidewalks, no problems, to other states requiring them to be insured and fully licensed, which is a massive problem when you're looking to purchase a Segway and you just want to ride it around. Another thing to add on to this was purchasing a Segway was not easy. You had to go to a dealership for Segways. You couldn't just buy them online. You couldn't just go to a random store and purchase them. You had to go to a dealership and actually take a course on how to use them, which again limited the amount of people who are going to be willing to take the time to do that and learn about the Segway. Another problem that would become very apparent later on in the Segway's life cycle was the actual difficulty of riding one. And there were so many crashes as the years went on with this product, as there were so many people who just didn't know how to ride them, or maybe they were just very difficult to ride. This became very apparent in the 2015 Olympics, as Olympic sprinter Usain Bolt was actually hit by a cameraman riding one of these. Now, despite all of these challenges, Segway was still able to have success for quite a few years. That being said, competition would gradually grow in the form of another product. Now, if we think back, the Segway was quite large, it was very expensive, and it wasn't always allowed on certain roads and sidewalks, so that caused a lot of headache for a lot of consumers. It also wasn't the easiest to buy. Now imagine a product that was super simple, you could buy anywhere, you could ride it on sidewalks, and it was relatively cheap compared to the Segway. And that's where e-scooters come into this. This entire new product completely destroyed the average consumer's desire for a Segway. It was better in almost every single department than the Segway was, just because it was easy, it was affordable for the average customer, where Segway just wasn't. There was no rules and regulations around these e-scooters, and the e-scooter market exploded in all the ways the Segway market was original. Now, after years of trying to fight off the competition, Segway finally gave in, and as a company announced that it would no longer be making the Segway personal transporter. One of the things that Segway was able to do was that it was able to find the markets that it did belong in. Segway still produces personal transportation devices for police officers and for certain professional industries, and it also has pivoted into making e-scooters and other devices that are more compliant and easy to use with the average consumer and their day-to-day tasks. Now, what are the lessons we can actually learn from Segway as a company that had massive hype in the beginning to slowly dying out and kind of pivoting and still being around, but just not in the same way it was in its former glory? And I think there's 4 big lessons to learn here. The first one is you need to test the market and preferably do it on the small scale. With Segway, they tried to appeal to the average person, and there was just no spot in the actual market for a $5,000 personal mode of transportation that really wasn't a car, and it was very expensive, and it was big, and it was clunky, and there was a lot of regulations around it. There just wasn't a spot for that. And if they had tested that early on in the product's life cycle with just a few different consumer bases, maybe it was police officers or professionals in general, maybe it was that average customer, and just tried and figured out who really resonates with this, who can afford this, who actually wants this and it's useful to them, they would have figured out very early on that the average person probably isn't a great fit for this, but there are other industries like tourism and like police officers that have the budget for this and actually like using it. And that would have saved them a ton of money when it comes to the general advertising and just going in a bad direction with the product overall. The second lesson I'd really like to emphasize here is hype and money does not mean success. You can have a product with a ton of money backing behind it. You can have a ton of hype. You can have so many people talking about it, and the product still fails. The reason for this is if there is no market for your product, it doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how much you've invested. We've seen companies time and time again where they will put billions of dollars into a product and it will fail because they did not, 1, test the actual market, and 2, see if there was any market to begin with. And this is what we saw with Segway. Was there a couple niche markets that Segway belonged to and they can still thrive in to this day? Yes, but the average consumer that they tried to go after in the very beginning, that market just wasn't there. And despite all the hype and everything they had backing them, that portion of their marketing just failed. Now, the third lesson I think we can all learn here is understanding customer needs. And there are so many people that they have a problem and they just want that thing solved. If we invent a problem that the customer doesn't actually have, and then we go to market and we have a whole bunch of money behind our product and we, market it everywhere and we get a massive following and everyone's talking about it, we have a whole bunch of investors, but there is no need for it, that product's still not going to sell. So that's something we really need to look into when we are in marketing. We have to make sure that there is a problem or there is something that we can benefit the consumer. What innovation are we going to actually create that will improve the life of the consumer? And with Segway, was Segway a cool feature to have and it was a cool technology? Absolutely yes. And there was a ton of backers behind it? Absolutely yes. But the average person just didn't want it. And that's really where Segway fell flat. Now, the final lesson I want to talk to you guys about is Segway's ability to adapt. Despite a near catastrophic failure, Segway still managed to pivot and find markets that still wanted its product and then come up with new products that would serve the general market better. Could they have done this earlier on? Yes. Could they have tested it earlier on? Yes. All that, yes. But they didn't die, and Segway still lives on to this day, despite not being the same size as it once was. Segway was able to live on, and I think that overall is a success story, and shows that if you're willing to adapt and keep trying, there is hope, provided you get the actual data feedback and you are able to adjust your product for your customer. Now, I want to leave you with a quote that is kind of controversial, and I don't completely agree with, but I do think it is thought-provoking, so I'm going to leave you with it regardless. Curiously enough, what got Segway into this problem was that the company was itself a kind of Segway. It was too easy for them. They were too successful raising money. If they had to grow the company gradually by iterating through several versions they sold to real users, they'd have learned pretty quickly that people looked stupid riding them. Instead, they had enough to work in secret. They had focus groups aplenty, I'm sure, but they didn't have the people yelling insults out of cars. So they never realized that they were zooming confidently down a blind alley. Paul Graham.